Nicole stepped around a pile of wooden fence stakes held together with twisted wire and bent rusted nails. Sheet metal leaned up against the rotted remains of a wooden bench and picnic table, with broken down buildings and tetanus-filled piles of trash overtaken by vines, rodents, and reptiles. This wasn't the area of the river most people saw. She knelt beside the riverbank and took another photo, careful to center the image and adjust for lighting. Everyone teased her about her film camera, saying she should switch to digital, but she was always the first one they called when they needed high-quality photographs. Nicole glanced around, seeking her next shot. How could anyone question the fact that something terrible was happening to the lake and the surrounding area? All the plant life around the lake's edge was wilting and dying. There had also been many cases of illness reported from people who swam downstream during the summer. Besides those signs of pollution, an obvious warning of trouble was the orange-red coating beginning to collect on the surface of the water. That could only mean something was being leaked or dumped into the river and connecting lake. It would only get worse unless someone did something. Maybe when the water and soil samples came back from the lab, the SES could do something. They would have already had the results if the test facility hadn't mysteriously burned down with earlier samples inside at the time. After that, it was her parents' accident, putting things on hold for quite some time. They were finally doing something again, but the new samples needed to be sent off to a test facility located several hours away, and with a long list of specimens to test before they would get to the SES samples. Nicole leaned against the side of an old, abandoned warehouse while she took one final picture. The wind was blowing, enough to move the leaves in the trees, and making for a very nice picture if you overlooked the signs of pollution. The breeze felt good, cooling her off a little and a welcome relief in the unseasonably warm weather. She snapped another photograph and stiffened. She could hear low sounds coming from inside the warehouse, which sounded like voices. But why would anyone be out here? These buildings weren't used by anyone. They were practically condemned. She walked around to the other side of the building, following the noises until they were loud enough to confirm they were voices, though she couldn't make out what they were saying. She searched the immediate area and located a spot where there was a hole in the wood, an oddly shaped opening between two planks in the wall. It wasn't large, just big enough to see through. Bracing her hands against the wall, she leaned closer and peered in through the small opening. It was dark inside, and it took a minute for her eyes adjust, but when they did, she was able to make out at least 5 people standing inside the abandoned building. 3 of the men carried battery-powered lanterns and moved around the back of a work truck parked near the far wall. The other 2 men stood in front of the light provided from the truck's headlights. Nicole recognized one of the men right away and experienced a rush of excitement. It was Rodney Stiegel, the vice president of Stiegel and Company. Rodney was also the nephew of the president of the company, George Stiegel. Nepotism was obviously alive, and well, in this particular company, Rodney wasn't the picture of leadership his title suggested in this instance. Dressed as he was in a Hawaiian shirt, black leather pants, and wearing several gold necklaces around his thick neck. They gleamed whenever they caught any stray beams of light in the abandoned building. He had long dark hair and teeth which were just crying out for the attention of a dentist, which was surprising, considering how much money his family had. That money hadn't stopped Rodney from leading a particularly shady life, complete with numerous run-ins with authorities. Even though he'd been in regular trouble with the law, his uncle's considerable influence and money always kept Rodney out of jail. Nicole suspected if his uncle would get out of the way and let his nephew pay for his own mistakes, everyone would be better off. Stiegel and Company was a reputable business before he'd taken over. Rodney Stiegel had no respect for anyone, least of all his family, whose good name and company he was running into the ground. While Nicole watched, Rodney directed the other men while they loaded huge barrels into the back of a truck. The labels on the barrels read, "Caution, toxic materials." Nicole's heart beat faster. This was her chance. Even if she couldn't prove they were dumping the toxins, she could prove the fact that Rodney Stiegel and his henchmen had the toxins near the lake. Up until now, he'd been denying even that fact. This might be just the kind of evidence they needed to stop him. Nicole held the camera to the small hole and started snapping pictures. Nancy drew. "Eat your heart out," she murmured to herself. She got several clear shots of the barrels and some photos of the men helping Rodney. Unfortunately, Rodney was never standing where she could get a clear picture of him. If she couldn't get a photo of him with the barrels, she wouldn't be able to prove he'd been there. On the other hand, if she got caught, none of the pictures could be used, and even if she didn't have a photograph of him, some of those other men could lead the police back to Rodney. Something was better than nothing. She was about to give up when he finally moved into her line of sight. She triumphantly snapped one last picture and quickly started to curse silently when her camera began to rewind the film loudly. "Hey, what's that noise out there?" one of the men cried. Nicole scrambled backwards, nearly falling, stumbling over her own feet in her hurry, and ran as fast as she could back through the building toward the tree. She was instantly struck by how dark it had gotten. Preoccupied with getting a photograph of Rodney with the barrels, she hadn't noticed the sun setting. She noticed it now, though, barely able to see where she was going. Somehow she made it as far as the woods. Shadows crowded in around her from every side, making each step a risk because she had neither the light nor the time to see where her feet were landing. She only prayed she wouldn't hit a dip in the ground at a bad angle and twist an ankle, or worse. Branches scraped her, catching and pulling on her hair and clothes. Pain emanated from multiple cuts, and her scalp was sore in several places. Still, she ran faster, the pain only feeding into her adrenaline. She could hear them getting closer. The covering of the trees thinned enough to allow some moonlight to shine through. Nervously, she cast a quick glance over her shoulder. A gasp escaped her mouth when her toe connected with something hard. A raised tree root caught her eye when she fell forward in pain, shot up through her knees and elbows. After the initial shock passed, she hurried to stand, ignoring the pain, but she froze on her hands and knees at the sound of a soft click behind her. Looking back over her shoulder, she saw a big, burly man standing about 8 feet away with a gun pointed at her. "Well, what have we got here? You're a cute one. Too bad you had to nose around, or we could have had a little fun." He chucked, and the hairs on Nicole's neck stood on end. Maybe we still could. He leered at her, and a shiver of revulsion ran over her skin. The grin left his face when he noticed her reaction. It was replaced by a menacing glare filled with rage. He aimed the gun at her and slowly pressed down on the trigger. A muffled shot rang out. Nicole dropped to the ground, the bullet barely missing her. It had been close, enough that she'd felt her hair being ruffled by the movement of the bullet past her head. The man cursed under his breath and took aim to fire again. She peered up at him from the ground and swallowed heavily. This time, she had nowhere to go. Her heart pounded in her chest as he pulled the trigger again. Out of the darkness, a large, black creature appeared. It jumped from its hiding place in the forest and landed hard on the man's back. His second shot
went wild, and the gun fell to the ground. Nicole scrambled to pick it up, and the black creature, a wolf, backed off as she aimed the gun at the man. "Stand up," slowly, she commanded. She managed to keep her voice steady. But it was a struggle. Out the corner of her eye she saw the wolf. She took a careful step away from the animal, but its eyes were trained on her attacker. "Whoa, wait a second. What do you think you're doing?" The man held his hands up, slowly getting to his feet. In the distance, Nicole could hear the sounds of the other men searching. She didn't have long. The gunshots had been muffled by a silencer, so they couldn't betray her position, but if this man could find her, so could they. She felt panic, threatened to bubble up, and squashed it down. That wouldn't help her. She could break down and be afraid once this was over. "Turn around," she said, holding the gun steadily at his chest. He took a second or two before complying, muttering to himself as he turned. She reached down and grabbed a fallen tree limb, one that looked heavy enough for her requirements, and tested its weight in her free hand. Gathering her strength, she stepped up behind her would-be murderer, careful to keep her distance from the wolf, and swung the wood at the back of his head. It connected with a hollow crack which sent a shudder of revulsion through her as he fell limp at her feet. She stared at his prone form in amazement. She hadn't really thought she had the strength to knock someone out in a single hit, but the proof was lying right in front of her. The noises in the woods around her began to get louder, drawing her attention from the man lying at her feet. They were clearly getting closer, but she didn't know what to do. Should she just start running again? Trying desperately to feel her way through the dark patches of the forest where moonlight failed to reach? The wolf startled her from her thoughts and gripped the corner of her jacket in his teeth, pulling her to one side. She yelped and stared down at the wolf with fear. She contemplated using the gun or the wood against the animal, but he let go of her clothes and took a step back from her. His muzzle lowered deferentially. A wave of calm came over her. She experienced a strange certainty that the animal was trying to lead her away from the approaching danger, but could she even consider following a wild animal through the night? Nicole mentally shook herself. Yeah, right, a strange wolf was just going to show up and rescue her, showing her exactly which way to go. That would be the day. Nicole cast a quick look over her shoulder, in the direction of the sounds. She didn't have much time. Turning in the opposite direction from the one the wolf was pulling her towards, Nicole began to run. She ran for several minutes before admitting to herself that she was completely lost. The trees were too thick in most spots for her to see even a hint of the stars overhead, and she had to admit to herself that she'd lost all sense of direction. For all she knew, she could be headed back toward the water or in a completely different direction. Taking a moment to catch her breath in one of the rarely lit areas, an oasis in the darkness, she collapsed on the ground, resting her head in her hands. A warm muzzle pushed closer to her, moving her hands out of the way until she was looking directly in the wolf's eyes. Beautifully clear eyes stared back at her. For a moment, she forgot these were the eyes of an animal. They seemed so coherent, staring directly into her soul. And in that instant, she knew there was something different about this animal. She could trust this wolf. She didn't know how she knew, but with this realization came such a sense of rightness. She didn't doubt the truth of her decision. If she was going to survive the night, she had to follow the wolf. Inhaling sharply, she stood and followed her unlikely ally. The wolf led her through the woods for several minutes, before he came to a stop in front of a thick section of bushes. Nicole looked questioningly from the bushes to the wolf, and he angled his head towards them. "Okay, so what's behind bush number 1?" she mumbled to herself. Leaning forward, Nicole pushed the bushes to one side and found herself staring down the beginning of a long tunnel. The wolf leapt in past the bushes and waited for her to follow. "Why not?" she muttered to herself. It was better than the alternative of running blindly through a dark forest. She activated the safety catch on the gun, tucking it into the back of her pants. There wasn't much room to maneuver in the tunnel, and she didn't want to chance it accidentally firing. Grasping at her necklace, she drew on its warmth for comfort and tentatively entered the tunnel entrance. Nicole winced when her knees and arms rubbed up against the tunnel wall. She suspected she'd suffered some pretty good scrapes during her earlier fall. There was no time to worry about that now, so she ignored the pain and pushed on. The wolf led her through what seemed like miles of tunnel. She crawled through them silently, one hand resting on the wall of the tunnel, and the other on the back of the wolf. It was much colder in the tunnel than it had been outside, and the longer she crawled, the colder it got. Her hands began to shake where she touched the tunnel wall, and she suspected she would easily see her breath if there'd been enough light to allow it. She wished she'd worn a thicker coat. Nevertheless, she pushed the cold from her mind and continued to crawl. Instead, she concentrated on the sound of her camera hitting her chest as it swung back and forth in front of her. She was lucky she'd used the strap today, or she would have lost the camera ages ago, in her mad dash from the warehouse. she slowly became aware of a light up ahead. Minute by minute, she found. She was able to see the tunnel walls and the mysterious wolf beside her. Everything was bathed in a mixture of light and shadows filtering in from between the branches of wild bushes. Nicole climbed out of the tunnel, the bushes snapping back into place, covering the tunnel opening behind her, and stared at her surroundings in shock. She found herself standing 100 feet away from her own apartment building. "How did you?" she began, but when she looked behind her, the wolf was gone. She turned back to the building, her necklace clutched between her fingers, and then turned back to where the wolf had been. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. Hurrying upstairs, she picked up the phone, dialing the numbers swiftly. "Hello. Hey John, it's Nicole. You know how you wanted those photos?" Artemis disappeared back into the shadows. So, this was where Nicole lived. Now, it had to be her. She was wearing the amulet, and he could see a distinct resemblance to Richard and Caroline. David Coverton had done a good job of hiding her all these years. Who would have thought that pitiful excuse for a man would have so many connections, willing to help him in this town? It must have been through his association with Richard. Artemis spat on the ground in disgust, the spit congealing in the dirt. He trudged on, dispersing the gathered pieces of muddy earth in short order. In the days after the crash, David had managed to hide all traces of Nicole, and no one he'd approached would say a word about her whereabouts. But no matter. Now, David had led Artemis right to her. Following David had been a long shot, but it had finally paid off, and what a payoff it would be. Now that he'd located Nicole, he could finally put his plans into action. The events of tonight had been an interesting development. It looked as if she'd managed to get herself into quite a bit of trouble. Maybe he could use this threat against her to further his own plans. He felt a shiver run down his spine when a particularly cold breeze blew past, but he knew this was no natural wind. In fact, he knew it all too well. The darkness gathered around him, and fog began rolling in, obstructing any ability to see beyond a few feet. What felt like immense pressure pressed down all around him in the air. The fog swirled around, a figure slowly taking shape in the darkness. "I see you finally found her," a deep, resonating voice said. "Yes." Artemis ignored the stubborn desire to defend himself against the implication that his search had taken too long and forced the word past his lips. "Good. Have you found out anything useful?" "She has apparently made some enemy. She was attacked a short while ago, down near the river." The voice was quiet for a moment. "Yes, that is good information to know. Keep watching her and tell me anything you discover." "Of course." Quickly, the fog and unnatural darkness disappeared. Artemis took a moment to get his bearings, then continued on his way. If he was going to be staying in town for a while, he needed to find a place to stay. Maybe that old inn would still be open for business and he could go for a drink in the bar. He grinned and changed directions. He'd quite enjoyed the old inn the last time he was in town. Now, it probably didn't offer the same services it had offered back then, but he might still find himself a little entertainment for the night. It was usually easy enough to find, for the right price. Artemis grinned and licked his lips in anticipation. David unlocked and opened the large gate. It creaked noisily as the hinges protested many years of disuse. He'd hoped he wouldn't have to come back here, and for years, that wish had been granted. Ever since those first couple of months after the plane crash, he'd stayed away. He walked up to the front doors of the house and paused, remembering the first time he saw them. They'd seemed even larger to the young boy he'd been back then, and this place had intimidated him. He was a lot older now, but he was surprised to realize it still intimidated him. So much was expected of him here. He couldn't hide from his potential. He couldn't hide from other people. After a while, he hadn't minded so much, but all that changed when Richard died. David had fallen into the same old patterns, leaving everything he knew, again. He'd stayed away from everyone and everything. It was a lonely but safe existence. Now, he was out of hiding and had to face the world again. Damn Richard. Even from beyond the grave, he was forcing David to face his demons. What if he didn't want to face them? What if he liked them just fine where they were? Hidden? Unfortunately, it looked as if it didn't matter what he wanted, he wasn't going to get it. He might as well get things over with. David pushed open the large door with a sigh. The creaking sound it made echoed through the empty rooms. Dim, early morning light shone through the curtains and the open door, illuminating the otherwise darkened room. There was dust everywhere, even though he'd hired people to come in and clean the place a couple of times each year. It was nothing like it had been. Richard and Caroline had kept the place spotless most of the time. What would Richard think if he could see it now? David quickly pushed that thought back and focused on more practical matters. He needed to call someone to take care of the place if he was going to be staying here. It was much too big for one person to manage alone. He braced himself and walked through the many rooms, stubbornly refusing to let the long-forgotten memories overwhelm him. He had a job to do, and after that, he could leave again. But for now, first things first, he needed to get this place suitable to live in. Pulling out his cell phone, David started making calls. Nicole pushed back the covers and swung her legs around, giving up on the prospect of going back to sleep. She was too anxious to be rid of the film. She started when her bare feet touched the cold floor, and quickly pulled on some socks before she traversed the floor, careful to avoid her bruises and sore muscles. She threw on the first shirt and pair of jeans she found, from her only worn once so still mostly clean pile of dirty laundry, and decided on a walk before class. It was still quiet on the streets. Most sane people were still asleep, but she liked the quiet. It was the easiest time to think at this hour of day. The sun was just rising, causing all kinds of colors to play across the sky. There was no sign of the wolf, not even by the tunnel, mostly hidden unless you knew precisely where to look. She walked the few blocks to school, not really knowing where else to go. The campus was even quieter than the rest of the city. A few office lights were on here and there, and she found herself wondering what had other people up at this early hour. Were they working on some important research which just had to be completed right away? Maybe they loved their jobs so much, they couldn't wait to get started, or they hated being at home so much, the office was a better alternative. Maybe they were just grading a few last papers before classes started. Nicole smiled at an early morning jogger, and he smiled back when he passed her on the sidewalk. Whatever brought those other people out, she felt oddly comforted by them being there, even knowing most weren't even aware she was here. Nicole tested the chapel door, and it opened with a creak. Surprisingly enough, there was one other person already inside. A young girl sitting in the front row turned her tear-stained face to Nicole when she entered. Nicole smiled comfortingly, and the girl offered a weak half-smile back, before retreating into her thoughts once again. Nicole sighed. It seemed she wasn't the only one with problems. Nicole settled down in a nearby pew and stared at the cross in the front of the church. She tried to remember the last time she'd attended church, acknowledging that it had been a long time. The last time she'd come close had been her parents' funeral. She didn't really know why she was here now. She didn't have any questions or favors to ask, she just felt unsettled. No matter what she did lately, she was restless, as if there was something else she needed to be doing. She wasn't accomplishing anything. She wasn't going anywhere. Nothing ever changed. Where was the excitement which was supposed to follow just being alive? She was only in college, and she was already locked into a pattern. These were supposed to be the exciting years in her life, but there was never any real excitement. There was never any spontaneity. Everything was planned. She went to class. She went to SES meetings. She ate lunch with Meg at the diner. She went home, watched TV, did homework, and went to bed. Occasionally, if she was lucky, she would have a new errand to run or some shopping to do. She'd known it was bad when she thought back on almost getting shot last night as a refreshing change of pace. Nicole tilted her head from side to side, stretching out a crick in her neck and looked at her watch. It was still early, but she might as well go wait in the classroom. There was no point in walking all the way back to her apartment, and she could read until class started. She glanced once more at the girl in the front pew before slipping silently out of the chapel. Nicole watched over the top of her book as one person after another entered the classroom. John only came in just as class was about to start and Nicole scowled at him for being so late, but she experienced a wave of relief. She would be glad to rid herself of the burden of the incriminating film. "What happened to you?" A crease formed on John's forehead as he scanned her, his eyes settling on her face. "Huh?" she asked in confusion. She hadn't slept well, but she didn't think she looked that bad. "You've got a nasty scrape on your chin." Oh. She'd forgotten all about most of the scrapes she received last night, and hadn't even noticed the one on her chin. It was the bruises on her knees and arms which really hurt, and her palms didn't feel too good either. "I fell in the woods last night. Are you okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine." She shrugged it off. "It's just a few scrapes and scratches. A couple of bruises, maybe a splinter or two, oh, and I don't recommend running so far or fast when you haven't had time to properly stretch first. But otherwise, I'm no worse for wear. Don't worry about it. Here's the roll of film." She purposely left out any reference to the wolf. He would think she was crazy if she started talking about a wild animal knowing exactly where she lives. Or worse, he'd call animal control to check out the wolf sighting and possibly get the animal killed in the process. John didn't look convinced that she was okay, but he took the film without further comment about her physical state. "This will definitely do some good. I'll give it to Susan today." He pocketed the film and leaned on a nearby desk. "Susan? You don't mean Susan Anderson, do you?" Susan Anderson was the junior attorney working on the case against Stiegel and Company. Nicole had heard the name mentioned at SES meetings many times before, but never by first name alone. "Yeah," he said nonchalantly. "I went to school with her younger sister. We were all pretty close." Nicole laughed. "Have you got any other influential people stashed away I should know about?" John just smiled. The teacher walked in, and the other students started settling into their seats. "I'll talk to you later, let you know how everything goes." "You'd better." "Oh, hey, walk with me to my apartment after class. I have something else Susan may want, but I couldn't bring it here." "Sure thing." An hour later, Nicole handed over the gun to John. She explained a few more details of her forest escape, still leaving out the wolf, and they both headed out. Nicole to class and John to see Susan. Several of the wrinkles on her forehead smooth out now that she had one less thing to worry about. Now, all she had to worry about was school. Her classes crawled by, as usual, and Nicole fought to stay awake during her lectures. A couple of times, she actually jerked awake when her chin dipped towards her chest. When the last class finished, she headed to the diner to have a late lunch with Meg. Nicole reached for the door handle of the diner and paused when a reflection in the glass door caught her eye. There was a man standing across the street, and he appeared to be staring right at her, through the reflection. The man wore sunglasses and a dark trench coat which moved hypnotically in the wind. She couldn't seem to look away, not even to search the street behind her where he must surely be standing. The reflection of a large truck driving by temporarily blocked her view, breaking the spell. She turned to look for him, but when the truck had passed, he was gone. She surveyed up and down the street, but there were no obvious places he could have disappeared so quickly. Nicole shook her head to clear the confusion filling her mind. She'd probably imagined the whole thing. That's what happened when you didn't get enough sleep, especially after the night she'd had. Obviously, her imagination was working overtime. That was the only explanation. Pushing the strange incident out of her mind, she opened the door and entered the diner. Nicole sat down at her usual table and ordered a cup of coffee to drink while she waited for Meg. She didn't have to wait long. Meg came in with her usual enormous load of books and tossed them all on the seat along with herself. Typical Megan overdramatics. She pulled her long, curly, red-brown hair back into a clip, making her heart-shaped face and perfect tan even more noticeable. "Hey, Meg. Hard day?" "Oh, no more than usual," Meg said with a sigh. "Oh, course, my usual. Would stress out the president." "Yeah, he only has to deal with nuclear takeovers and global annihilation." "You have physics with Ms. Fortenberry." "No contest." "Fun New York." Meg kicked out at Nicole, making them both laugh. "So, what happened?" Meg asked, after she'd managed to stop laughing. "What do you mean?" "Nicole, this is me you're talking to. I know you too well. You're drinking coffee, and you only do that when you've got something on your mind. Besides, I count at least 3 scrapes, and you're not that clumsy." Nicole stared down at her coffee cup. She'd known the scrapes would probably give her away, but she hadn't even thought about the coffee. Meg was right, though, drinking coffee when she was preoccupied was a habit she'd picked up in middle school. She'd started drinking it initially to stay awake after she'd had the nightmare. The habit seemed to re-emerge nowadays whenever something worried or intrigued her. Today, it was a little of both. "Yeah, you're right. Something happened yesterday when I went to take the photos down by the river." "What happened?" Meg leaned across the table, interest visible in her pretty features. Nicole took a breath and started talking, spewing out a stream of words. "I stumbled across Stiegel trying to get rid of some toxins by the lake, so I took some photos, but I got caught. I got the scrapes when I was running away from Stiegel and his cronies, because they'd heard my camera rewinding the film. I tripped over a tree root and fell, and one guy caught up with me and he had a gun. Just when I was about to get shot, a wolf jumped out of the woods and knocked over the guy with the gun. I got lost again, and the wolf helped me find my way home. But that's all over now. I gave the film to John, and he's going to Take care of things from here. Meg leaned back in the seat and whistled. Wow! No wonder you're drinking coffee. With a brief grin, Nicole leaned in, tapping her fingers against the side of her coffee cup. I've been thinking about that black wolf. Don't you think it's weird? I'm about to become a statistic, when he just shows up out of nowhere? She shook her head. Are you sure it was a wolf? Meg asked, and Nicole shot her a frustrated look. Never mind, you're the wolf expert. She sighed and thought for a second. Someone was definitely looking out for you. Hey, maybe the wolf was your spirit guide or something. You've always been obsessed with all things wolf-related. It would make sense that a spirit guide would take a form that has meaning for you. I did get a strange feeling when I looked in his eyes. It seemed as if I could completely trust him, like I knew him. And then he led me home, away from the other men who were chasing me. Do you really think he could be a spirit guide? Meg shrugged. Anything's possible. I mean, whatever way you want to look at it, you were being protected. I don't know if it's a spirit guide or even an angel, but someone was definitely watching over you. Nicole shuddered when a thought occurred to her. If someone or something, supernatural or not, is looking out for me, I hope they keep doing it. If that guy got a good look at me. Meg reached across the table and took Nicole's hands in her own, careful not to touch her scrapes. Look, whether he did or not, you'll end up on your feet. I've always said you have 9 lives, and you're nowhere near using them all up. Meg, she groaned, you know I don't like that cat analogy. It's not even accurate. Sure it is. You're the luckiest person I know. I don't know if lucky is how I'd characterize it. Nicole, remember the time a wrong number woke you up, just in time to make you aware of that gas leak you and Billy were sleeping through? And what about the time we accidentally got locked in that freezer when you wanted to go exploring? Hey, it wasn't just me, Nicole replied defensively. True, Meg conceded, but we were in there for what had to be an hour. When the door suddenly opened, with no sign of anyone releasing the catch. Now, you're getting shot at and saved by a wolf. Sounds like par for the course to me. Anyway, let's eat, I'm starved. Nicole laughed. Deep down, she was still worried about everything, but there was nothing she could do to change the situation, so she decided to concentrate on other things for now. They ate lunch without broaching any serious subjects, and Meg kept her entertained with a running commentary regarding students on campus. Nicole always found herself amazed by how much gossip Meg knew. How did she hear so much? No matter what the source, she always felt better after talking to Meg. She was a reminder that Nicole had a friend who would listen to her ramblings and not judge her for trusting a strange wolf, and be concerned about her well-being, but respectful enough of Nicole not to be overbearing with well-meaning advice. Nicole chuckled and Meg finished a story about the psych major who'd shown up to her drama class wearing fishnet stockings, diving flippers and goggles along with a feathered boa. No reason. Just because he wanted to. Tell me you got pictures. No, Meg shook her head regretfully. But someone else in class took pics with her phone, and she said she'd download the pictures and send them to everyone. That's great. They'll make the perfect addition to your wall of shame. Both girls grinned in agreement. Meg's wall of shame had started out simply enough, as just a few pictures taped to the wall beside her bed. It had since evolved into almost an entire wall full of pictures of them and their friends, and a few strangers, caught in a range of funny and memorable poses. Everything worth photographing, which had happened in the last 5 years, since Nicole first got her camera, had been added to Meg's wall. Nicole was responsible for about 2/3 of the pictures on the wall, but once word spread to their friends and acquaintances, several pictures had been donated to the wall. There was even one picture of some guy neither of them had met, wearing nothing but a roll of yellow police tape. Pretty soon, Meg was going to have to move on to another wall, or buy a scrapbook. They lapsed into a comfortable silence while they waited for their bills. Nicole absent-mindedly tapping her fork on the side of her plate and Meg glancing at her to-do list in her planner. Nicole was halfway through tapping out the latest car insurance jingle before she realized the song was stuck in her head again. Great. Just when she got the song out of her head, now she would be singing it all day. She rolled her eyes and forced herself to stop tapping. Just then, she noticed Meg tapping out the same beat with her fingers. How long have you been thinking that jingle? Nicole asked, suspiciously. Meg looked up, momentarily confused until she realized what Nicole was referring to. Oh, I don't know. Pretty much all day, I guess. It got stuck in my head this morning, and I haven't been able to get rid of it. Nicole groaned. Can't you think of any better songs? Now you've got it stuck in my head, too. Meg put her hands up defensively, but the gesture was belied by the teasing grin. Hey, can I help it if you always seem to tap into my brain when I'm thinking of annoying songs? You should tune in when I get musicals going through my mind. Nicole gave her the, and you're telling me this because, look. Okay, I'll think of another song. Meg was quiet for a moment, her teeth nibbling on her bottom lip. Then, a big grin broke out on her face. Instantly, Nicole could hear the chorus of I Need a Hero going through her head. She sighed and rested heavily on her bent arms on the table. What? I thought it would be appropriate, Meg said with an innocent look on her face. Looking very proud of herself, Meg proceeded to tap out the new tune on the table. In spite of herself, Nicole was humming along by the time the waitress walked up with their checks. The waitress picked up the rest of their dishes and left behind their bills. I've got it, Nicole said, picking up both bills. What? No, I've got mine covered, Meg argued, digging around in her bag. For her purse. Besides, I know with all the expenses you've had lately, you can't afford to keep doing things like this. Nicole sobered at the reminder of the funeral and the other expenses which the life insurance hadn't quite covered. I can afford what I want to afford. Besides, this is my treat for you listening to all my crap. And I won't take no for an answer. If you insist. Meg's lips curved in a mischievous grin. But I just remembered I still owe you for the movie we went to last week, so here you go, she said, passing Nicole a $10 bill. Nicole rolled her eyes and gave an exaggerated sigh, but took the money. They both stood to leave and headed for the exit. So, Meg slapped a hand down on Nicole's shoulder. These guys who are after you, you want I should beat any of them up for you? She asked with a wicked grin and a twinkle in her eyes. Nicole smiled back. Sure, but only if I can help. Meg's grin broke into a full-blown smile. Oh, I do love it when you get all violent. Her eyes sparkled brightly as she put emphasis on the last word. Just paying homage to the master, Nicole said, indicating Meg with the gesture of her hand. Meg simply gave a little half bow and opened the door for them both. With a higher spring in her step than before, Nicole headed home.